September 1942. In the remote valleys of East Tennessee, families who had lived on their land for generations received letters that changed everything. They had 2 weeks to leave. No explanation. No appeal. Just go. Within months, an entire community vanished from the map. Roads that had connected neighbors for a century led nowhere. Churches where families had worshipped since the Civil War stood empty, then gone. Cemeteries where ancestors rested were relocated, headstone by headstone. It was as if someone had taken an eraser to reality itself. But something was rising in place of what disappeared. Something so secret that the 75,000 people who would soon live there couldn't tell their families where they worked. Something so vast it would consume more electricity than New York City. Something that would end a war and reshape human history. This is the story of Oak Ridge, Tennessee, the town that never officially existed, built by people who never officially worked there, to create a weapon the world had never seen. The Manhattan Project is remembered for Los Alamos, where brilliant scientists designed the atomic bomb. It's remembered for Hanford, Washington, where plutonium was produced. But before any of that could happen, before Einstein's equations could become reality, the United States needed something else entirely. A massive industrial complex that could separate uranium-235 from uranium-238, atom by atom. They needed to build the impossible in secret, and they needed to do it fast. In September 1942, the war was going badly. Nazi Germany controlled Europe from the Atlantic to the gates of Moscow. Japan dominated the Pacific. American forces were dying in the jungles of Guadalcanal. And somewhere in occupied Europe, German scientists were racing to unlock the atom's power. The fear haunting Allied leaders was simple and terrifying. What if Hitler got the bomb first? Colonel Leslie Groves had just received the most important assignment of the war. A career Army engineer who had overseen construction of the Pentagon, Groves was blunt, demanding, and relentlessly efficient. He didn't want this job, he wanted combat command. But in September 1942, he was promoted to brigadier general and given a mission that would dwarf anything he'd imagined. Build a weapon that existed only in theory. Do it in absolute secrecy. Spend whatever it takes. And do it before the enemy. Groves needed 3 things: scientists to design the bomb, facilities to produce fissile material, and a place to build it all. Los Alamos would become the design laboratory. Hanford would produce plutonium. But the most challenging task, separating uranium-235, needed something unprecedented. He needed land. Lots of it. Isolated but accessible. Near water and power. Far from either coast, where enemy sabotage or bombing was possible. And he needed it fast. In late September 1942, Groves and his team identified a location. The valleys of East Tennessee, about 18 miles west of Knoxville, offered everything they needed. The Clinch River provided water. The Tennessee Valley Authority had recently completed Norris Dam, offering massive amounts of electricity. The terrain was rugged enough to hide activities, but flat enough to build on. And crucially, it was relatively unpopulated. Relatively, because 3,000 people lived there. Families who had farmed that land for generations. Communities with their own schools, churches, and cemeteries. People with lives, histories, and nowhere else to go. They would all have to leave. The government classified the entire project. Nobody could know what was being built or why. The legal mechanism was eminent domain, the government's power to seize private property for public use. But this was eminent domain on a scale never seen before. Nearly 60,000 acres. Entire communities. Everything. On October 7, 1942, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers began surveying the land. families started receiving letters. The wording was bureaucratic, cold, efficient. Your property has been designated for a federal project vital to the war effort. You must vacate within 2 weeks. Fair compensation will be provided. 2 weeks to leave homes that had been in families for generations. 2 weeks to pack up lives, find new places to live during a war when housing was scarce. 2 weeks to say goodbye to everything familiar. There was no negotiation, no appeal, no explanation of why. John Hendricks had predicted this. A local mystic who died in 1915, Hendricks had experienced visions of the future. He described a great city rising in Bear Creek Valley, where powerful forces would be harnessed for good and evil. People thought he was crazy. They called him Prophet John, with a mixture of mockery and unease. But in 1942, as bulldozers rolled into Bear Creek Valley, as communities vanished and something vast took their place, people remembered his words. He had seen it coming decades before it was possible. By November 1942, families were moving out. The government paid for the land, assessments that many felt were far below actual value. Some families had owned their land since before the Civil War. Some had businesses, farms that had sustained them for generations. Now they were getting checks and eviction notices. And still, nobody knew why. The challenge facing the Manhattan Project wasn't just scientific. It was industrial on a scale that bordered on fantasy. To understand what they needed to build, you have to understand the problem. Natural uranium consists almost entirely of uranium-238. Less than 1% is uranium-235. But only uranium-235 can sustain the chain reaction needed for a bomb. The two isotopes are chemically identical. You can't separate them through chemistry. They differ in weight by just 3 neutrons. The scientists needed to separate atoms based on a mass difference so tiny it was almost theoretical. And they needed to do it not with laboratory samples, but with tons of uranium. Industrial quantities. Enough to build multiple bombs. 3 methods were chosen for Oak Ridge. All of them unproven at industrial scale. All of them requiring technology that barely existed. The electromagnetic separation process, called Y-12, would use giant magnets called calatrons to separate uranium isotopes by their mass. The process was based on physics that worked beautifully in laboratories with milligram samples. Nobody had ever tried to scale it up to process tons of uranium. The magnets alone would require more silver than existed in available stocks. Eventually, the Treasury Department would loan 14,700 tons of silver to be wound into electromagnetic coils. The gaseous diffusion process, called K-25, would force uranium hexafluoride gas through thousands of barriers with microscopic holes. The lighter uranium-235 would pass through fractionally faster than uranium-238. Do this thousands of times, through thousands of stages, and you could separate the isotopes. In theory. Nobody had ever built a barrier that could withstand the corrosive uranium hexafluoride gas. Nobody had ever built a facility with thousands of stages working in perfect sequence. The building they needed would be the largest in the world, a structure so vast it would require its own internal transportation system. The liquid thermal diffusion process, called S-50, would use temperature gradients to separate the isotopes in liquid form. It was the least understood, most experimental of the 3 methods. All 3 would be built simultaneously. All 3 would feed into each other, with partially enriched uranium from one process going to another for further enrichment. It was a gamble measured in billions of dollars. Construction began before anyone knew if any of it would work. By January 1943, the scale of the operation was becoming clear. This wouldn't be a small research facility. This would be an entire city built from nothing, in the mountains of Tennessee, in secret during a war. The Army Corps of Engineers mobilized. Construction companies from across the country received contracts for projects they couldn't describe to anyone. Workers were recruited with promises of good pay, important war work, and no details whatsoever. They came by the thousands. Farm workers from Appalachia, factory workers from industrial cities, professionals looking for war work, people who needed jobs and didn't ask too many questions. At the peak, more than 80,000 construction workers swarmed over the site. What they built was unprecedented. Roads where there had been dirt paths, railways connecting to the outside world, a power plant, water treatment facilities, sewage systems, housing for tens of thousands, cafeterias that would serve 25,000 meals a day, schools, a hospital, churches, recreation facilities, an entire city's infrastructure built in months. And the factories, massive structures rising from Tennessee valleys, built to tolerances tighter than anything industry had ever attempted. The K-25 gaseous diffusion plant would cover 44 acres under one roof, a building so large that workers inside sometimes used bicycles to get around. The Y-12 electromagnetic plant would house machines weighing thousands of tons, operating with precision measured in fractions of millimeters. Security was total. The entire area was fenced. Guard towers watched the perimeter. Military police checked credentials constantly. Workers entered through controlled gates. Mail was censored. Phone calls were monitored. Taking photographs was forbidden. Discussing your work with anyone, even family living in Oak Ridge, could result in immediate dismissal or arrest. The site was given the designation Clinton Engineer Works to disguise its purpose. But workers and locals began calling it Oak Ridge, after the ridge that defined the area's geography. In March 1943, the first permanent residents began arriving. Scientists, engineers, technicians, people recruited for jobs they couldn't fully understand. They arrived at Knoxville train stations to be met by military personnel who told them little except to get on buses headed west. The buses drove through checkpoints into a city that officially didn't exist. Housing was whatever could be built fast. Prefabricated houses, barracks, trailers, hutments, flimsy wooden structures that leaked when it rained and froze when it got cold. For many residents, these primitive accommodations were home for years. The mud was legendary. East Tennessee clay, churned by constant construction and thousands of vehicles, became a thick, clinging soup that ruined shoes, stopped traffic, and tested everyone's patience. Workers walked on wooden planks laid across the worst areas. Vehicles got stuck constantly. The mud got into everything: homes, offices, machinery. But the work continued. By summer 1943, Oak Ridge was a city unlike any other. It had a population of 45,000 and growing. It had schools where teachers couldn't tell their families what town they worked in. It had churches where ministers preached to congregations who couldn't discuss their jobs. It had a hospital delivering babies born in a city that didn't officially exist. It had the highest concentration of PhD scientists outside of a major university. It had workers who barely finished grade school operating equipment worth millions. It had southern farm workers and northern intellectuals living next door to each other. It had military discipline and frontier chaos existing side by side. And everyone had the same question they couldn't ask out loud: what are we actually building? Compartmentalization was absolute. Workers at Y-12 didn't know what happened at K-25. Operators monitoring dials didn't know what the dials measured. Technicians maintaining equipment didn't know what the equipment was for. Scientists working on one aspect of the process couldn't discuss it with scientists working on another aspect. The official line was vague: important war work, defeating the enemy, bringing the boys home. But whispers circulated. Some guessed they were making rocket fuel. Others thought it was poison gas. Some suspected it was something to do with electricity or magnets because of all the power being used. A few suspected the truth, but they didn't say anything. The people who came to Oak Ridge were extraordinary in their ordinariness. There were the young women recruited from across the South to work as Calitron operators, jobs that required watching dials and adjusting controls without knowing what they controlled. Many had never been away from their hometowns. Some had barely finished high school, but they were smart, reliable, and teachable. There were the engineers and physicists recruited from universities and industry, men like Eugene Wigner and Enrico Fermi, who came to consult on processes they were inventing as they built them. There were the construction workers who built a city in record time, working around the clock in all weather, never knowing what they were building. And there were the families who lived there, raised children there, created a community in a place that officially didn't exist. By late 1943, the facilities were coming online. The Y-12 electromagnetic separation plant began operations in November 1943. Immediately, problems emerged. The Calitrons didn't work as designed. The magnetic coils shorted out. Contamination ruined batches. Production rates were far below projections. Teams worked around the clock troubleshooting. Scientists made adjustments. Operators learned through trial and error. Slowly, painfully, production increased. The K-25 gaseous diffusion plant was even more challenging. The barriers kept failing. Leaks appeared in the thousands of stages. The cascading system had to work perfectly or the entire process broke down. Construction continued while operations began, workers building later stages while earlier stages were already processing uranium. It was industrial and scientific improvisation on an unprecedented scale. Nobody had done this before. There were no textbooks, no established procedures. They were inventing everything as they went. The pressure was relentless. Every day without results was a day the enemy might get closer to their own bomb. Every problem that delayed production could mean the difference between winning and losing the war. And nobody outside Oak Ridge's fences knew any of this was happening. General Groves pushed everyone mercilessly. He demanded results. He wanted numbers. How much uranium-235 had been produced? When would there be enough for a bomb? He didn't accept excuses. The scientists and engineers pushed back. You can't rush physics. You can't force industrial processes to work before they're ready. Mistakes made in haste would set them back further than careful progress. The tension was constant. At Y-12, the young women operating the Calitrons became unexpectedly crucial. The scientists had assumed that experienced technicians would be needed for the precision work. But the Calitrons were temperamental. They required constant attention, subtle adjustments, an almost intuitive feel for when things were right. The young women, many of them teenagers fresh from Appalachian farms, turned out to be better operators than the trained technicians. They didn't overthink. They watched their dials, made their adjustments, and kept their machines running. They competed with each other to see who could get the best production numbers. They didn't know they were enriching uranium. They just knew they were good at their jobs. Years later, some of them would say it was the best job they ever had. Purpose without understanding. Contribution without recognition. They knew they were doing something important for the war. That was enough. But the cost was real. The work was monotonous and exhausting. 12-hour shifts, 6 days a week. The same dials, the same adjustments, hour after hour. The Calitron halls were hot, noisy, and filled with equipment that hummed and crackled. Some workers developed health problems from the radiation exposure nobody understood yet. Accidents happened. Electrical fires, chemical spills, equipment failures that released toxic gases. Workers were injured. Some died. But the accidents were classified. Families weren't told how their loved ones were hurt or what they were working with when they died. The human toll extended beyond the factories. The stress of secrecy wore on everyone. Marriages strained under the weight of things that couldn't be discussed. Families lived in primitive conditions, far from relatives, unable to explain where they were or what they were doing. Letters home were censored. Phone calls were monitored. The constant surveillance created an atmosphere of suspicion and paranoia. Some people couldn't handle it. They left Oak Ridge, abandoning good-paying jobs because the psychological weight was too much. Others stayed but struggled. Alcoholism increased. Domestic disputes multiplied. The military police dealt with fights, thefts, and breakdowns. But most people endured. They formed communities within the larger community. Churches became centers of social life. Schools gave children something approaching normalcy. Recreational facilities offered escape. People made friends, fell in love, got married, had children, all in a city that officially didn't exist. By early 1944, production was increasing. The Y-12 plant was producing grams of enriched uranium. Not enough yet, but the process was working. The K-25 plant was coming online stage by stage. The S-50 liquid thermal diffusion plant began operations. But grams weren't enough. They needed kilograms. Enough for multiple bombs. The scientists calculated that a critical mass, the amount needed for a bomb, would be approximately 50 kilograms of highly enriched uranium-235. At current production rates, it would take years to produce that much. The pressure intensified. Engineers redesigned processes. New techniques were implemented. More Calitrons were brought online. The K-25 plant expanded. Every part of the operation was pushed to its limits and beyond. Workers felt the urgency even if they didn't know the details. Production targets increased. Shifts got longer. Days off disappeared. Everyone understood that something critical was happening, that their work mattered more than they could know. In Europe, the war was turning. D-Day came in June 1944. Allied armies pushed into France. Soviet forces drove the Germans back from the east. Victory seemed possible. But intelligence about the German nuclear program remained uncertain. How close were they? Nobody knew for sure. The fear of losing the atomic race drove everything. At Oak Ridge, the machines ran without stopping. The Calitrons hummed. The gaseous diffusion cascades processed uranium hexafluoride day and night. The thermal diffusion columns operated continuously. Slowly, gram by gram, the stockpile of uranium-235 grew. By late 1944, Oak Ridge had become the fifth largest city in Tennessee. Nearly 75,000 people lived there. Only a handful knew what they were really building. Then, in December 1944, intelligence arrived that changed everything. Allied forces advancing into Germany found evidence that the German nuclear program was far less advanced than feared. They were years away from a bomb. The race was over. The Allies had won. But the Manhattan Project didn't slow down. Because by then, it wasn't about Germany anymore. Japan was still fighting. The war in the Pacific was brutal beyond imagination. Casualties mounted with every island invasion. Military planners projected that an invasion of the Japanese mainland could cost 1 million Allied casualties. The Japanese had shown they would fight to the death. Surrender seemed impossible. The atomic bomb had become the potential solution to end the war without a catastrophic invasion. At Oak Ridge, the work intensified. Every gram of uranium-235 brought the weapon closer to reality. By early 1945, production rates had increased dramatically. The processes were working. The industrial scale had been achieved. In February 1945, enough uranium-235 had been produced for the scientists at Los Alamos to begin assembling a weapon. Not enough for multiple bombs yet, but enough for one. Maybe two if they were careful. The people of Oak Ridge still didn't know what they were building, but some were starting to guess. In April 1945, President Roosevelt died. Vice President Harry Truman became president. He had never been briefed on the Manhattan Project. On his first day in office, he learned that the United States was building an atomic bomb and had spent $2 billion on it. In May 1945, Germany surrendered. Victory in Europe. But Japan fought on. At Oak Ridge, the uranium production continued. Scientists at Los Alamos were designing two types of bombs, one using uranium, one using plutonium from Hanford. They needed enough material for both. By June 1945, Oak Ridge had produced enough uranium-235 for a weapon. The material was shipped to Los Alamos in small batches, carried by couriers who had no idea what they were transporting. The workers at Oak Ridge still didn't know. They watched dials, adjusted controls, maintained equipment, and went home exhausted without understanding that they were building the most destructive weapon in human history. July 16, 1945. In the desert of New Mexico, at a site called Trinity, the first atomic bomb was tested. It used plutonium from Hanford, not uranium from Oak Ridge. But Oak Ridge's uranium would be next. The flash lit up the pre-dawn sky. The mushroom cloud rose 7 miles high. Scientists watching from bunkers knew that the world had changed forever. The bomb worked. The theory was reality. President Truman, attending the Potsdam Conference in Germany, received the news. He now had a weapon that could end the war. At Oak Ridge, the workers knew nothing about Trinity. They continued their jobs, watching the same dials, making the same adjustments. Some noticed that shipments of enriched uranium had increased. Some heard rumors that something big was about to happen. But officially, they knew nothing. August 6, 1945. A B-29 bomber named Enola Gay took off from Tinian Island carrying a weapon called Little Boy. It was a uranium bomb. The uranium-235 inside it came from Oak Ridge, produced by thousands of people who didn't know what they were making. At 8:15 a.m. local time, Little Boy detonated over Hiroshima, Japan. The explosion released energy equivalent to 15,000 tons of TNT. The city was devastated. Tens of thousands died instantly. Tens of thousands more would die from radiation and injuries. The war was effectively over. At Oak Ridge, workers heard the news on the radio like everyone else. President Truman's announcement mentioned atomic bombs and secret cities where they were produced. He mentioned Tennessee. Then the workers understood. The dials they had watched, the adjustments they had made, the equipment they had maintained, all of it had been building the most powerful weapon in history. Their work had ended the war. The reaction was complex. Pride mixed with horror. Relief mixed with guilt. They had helped win the war. They had helped kill more than 100,000 people. Some workers cheered. They had brought the boys home. Others were silent, struggling with what they had been part of. Many didn't know how to feel. The scale was too vast, the implications too enormous. For the families who had been forced from their land 3 years earlier, the news brought bitter understanding. Their homes had been destroyed so this weapon could be built. Their sacrifice had been for something real, something that changed history. But many still felt the loss. Their communities were gone. Their land was behind fences. They could never go home. In the months after Hiroshima, Oak Ridge's role became public. Newspapers described the secret city in Tennessee. Journalists visited and wrote amazed accounts of the city that wasn't supposed to exist. The workers became celebrities of a sort, the people who won the war in secret. But the euphoria faded quickly. 3 days after Hiroshima, a second bomb, the plutonium bomb from Hanford, destroyed Nagasaki. Japan surrendered on August 15th. The war was over. And then the world had to grapple with what had been created. The atomic bomb wasn't just a weapon. It was a new category of destruction. It was the power to annihilate cities, to kill hundreds of thousands in seconds, to poison the earth with radiation. At Oak Ridge, work continued. During the Cold War, the facility shifted from producing uranium for weapons to producing isotopes for medicine and research. The temporary wartime city became permanent. The population stabilized. Infrastructure improved. The mud was eventually paved over. The people who had worked there during the war aged. Some stayed in Oak Ridge for the rest of their lives. Others left but never forgot what they had been part of. They carried the secret for years before they could talk about it. Even after it was declassified, many struggled to explain what it had been like. The young women who operated the Calatrons went on with their lives. They raised families, had careers, grew old. For decades, they didn't talk much about their war work. It was classified. It was complicated. It was hard to explain. But in their later years, as historians began documenting the Manhattan Project, some of them shared their stories. They described the monotony and the purpose, the secrecy and the community, the pride and the horror. They were proud of what they had accomplished and haunted by what it had meant. Oak Ridge represents something unique in American history. A city created by government fiat, built in secret, populated by people who couldn't explain where they lived or what they did, all to produce a weapon that would reshape global politics for generations. The technological achievement was staggering. In less than 3 years, scientists and engineers took theoretical physics and turned it into industrial reality. They invented processes that didn't exist. They built machines that had never been conceived. They solved problems that seemed unsolvable. The scale was unprecedented. $2 billion, roughly $30 billion in today's money, spent on a project whose success was uncertain. An entire city built from nothing. Tens of thousands of workers mobilized. And all of it kept secret. The Manhattan Project is often remembered as a scientific triumph. But Oak Ridge reveals the industrial and human dimensions. The bomb wasn't just designed by brilliant scientists. It was built by ordinary people doing extraordinary work without understanding what they were building. The ethical questions have never been fully resolved. Was the bomb necessary to end the war? Could Japan have been defeated through conventional means? Were the civilians of Hiroshima and Nagasaki legitimate targets? These debates continue. The people of Oak Ridge carry their own version of these questions. They helped build the weapon. They enabled its use. Do they share responsibility for the deaths? Or were they simply doing their jobs in wartime? Most of them would say they helped end the war and save lives, both American and Japanese lives that would have been lost in an invasion. They believe they made the terrible choice that was necessary. But some struggle with it. The knowledge that their work, however small their individual contribution, was part of something that killed so many innocents. The moral weight doesn't disappear just because you were following orders or didn't know what you were doing. Oak Ridge also represents a moment when the relationship between science, government, and society fundamentally changed. Before the Manhattan Project, scientific research was mostly academic. After it, science became deeply intertwined with national security and government funding. The model established at Oak Ridge, massive government projects, classified research, scientists working on weapons, became standard during the Cold War. It shaped how science was done for decades. The legacy of secrecy also persists. Oak Ridge set the template for classified cities and black projects. The idea that the government could build entire facilities that officially didn't exist, employ thousands of people who couldn't discuss their work, and keep it secret became a permanent part of the American security state. For the communities displaced to build Oak Ridge, the legacy is more personal and painful. Their land is gone. Their cemeteries were moved. Their churches were demolished. The places where they lived, worked, and raised families exist only in memory and photographs. The government paid for the land, but no payment could compensate for what was lost. The connections to place, the continuity of generations, the sense of belonging, these things have no price. Some families have returned to visit. They stand at fences, looking at industrial facilities built where their homes once stood. They tell their children and grandchildren stories about what used to be there. But the land itself is forever changed. The sacrifice these families made was real, but it was invisible. There are no monuments to the people who lost their homes so Oak Ridge could be built. Their names aren't on memorials. Their contribution is footnoted in history books, if mentioned at all. Yet without their sacrifice, Oak Ridge couldn't have existed. Without Oak Ridge, the bomb might not have been built in time. The course of history might have been different. Today, Oak Ridge continues as a center for scientific research. The Y-12 facility still operates, now producing components for nuclear weapons. The K-25 building was demolished in 2013, the largest building demolition in history. What remains is a reminder of what was built there and what it cost. The American Museum of Science and Energy in Oak Ridge tells the story of the Manhattan Project. Visitors can see exhibits about the calatrons, the gaseous diffusion process, and the people who worked there. They can hear oral histories from the workers who built the bomb. But museums can only capture fragments of the full story. The fear and uncertainty. The pride and guilt. The strange experience of living in a city that officially didn't exist, working on a project you couldn't discuss, being part of history you wouldn't understand until it was over. The survivors are aging now. The youngest workers from 1945 are in their late 90s. Soon, there will be no one left who remembers Oak Ridge during the war. The story will be entirely historical, removed from living memory. But the implications of what happened at Oak Ridge remain urgent. We still live in the world the Manhattan Project created. Nuclear weapons still exist. The threat of atomic war still shapes global politics. The questions about scientific responsibility, government secrecy, and the ethics of weapons development are still unresolved. Behind the statistics and the strategic importance, Oak Ridge was always about people. Individual lives shaped by extraordinary circumstances. There was Colleen Rowan Black, a young woman from Tennessee who came to Oak Ridge in 1943. She was trained as a calotron operator. For 2 years, she watched dials and adjusted controls, never knowing what she was doing. When the bomb fell, she realized she had helped enrich the uranium. She carried that knowledge for the rest of her life, proud and troubled in equal measure. There was Willie Thompson, an African-American construction worker who helped build the Y-12 plant. He worked alongside thousands of others in segregated conditions. Black workers lived in separate housing, ate in separate cafeterias, and faced discrimination even while contributing to the war effort. The story of Oak Ridge includes this uncomfortable truth. Even in fighting fascism, America maintained its own systems of racial oppression. There was Jane Greer, who arrived at Oak Ridge as a young bride. Her husband worked at K-25, but he couldn't tell her what he did. They lived in a hutment that leaked when it rained and froze in winter. She gave birth to their first child in the Oak Ridge Hospital. For her, Oak Ridge was where she became a mother, where she learned to be resourceful, where she discovered she was stronger than she knew. There was the Jones family, who had farmed their land in East Tennessee for 5 generations. In 1942, they received the letter telling them to leave. They packed up their lives, moved to Knoxville, and watched from a distance as their family farm disappeared behind fences. Years later, when they learned what had been built there, they understood. But understanding didn't erase the loss. There was Dr. William Pollard, a physicist who worked on the electromagnetic separation process. He was brilliant, dedicated, and troubled by what he was helping create. After the war, he became an Episcopal priest, seeking to reconcile his role in building a weapon of mass destruction with his faith. He spent the rest of his life thinking about the moral dimensions of scientific work. Oak Ridge, Tennessee. A city built in secret to win a war. A place where 75,000 people lived and worked without officially existing. A massive industrial complex that changed the course of human history. The story of Oak Ridge reveals something profound about how history is actually made. It's not just great leaders making momentous decisions. It's ordinary people doing extraordinary work, often without understanding the larger implications. It's young women from Appalachian farms operating equipment they can't describe. It's construction workers building structures whose purpose they don't know. It's families displaced to make room for history. The Manhattan Project is remembered for the scientists, Oppenheimer, Fermi, Teller, the brilliant minds who designed the bomb. But the bomb wouldn't exist without the thousands of people who built the infrastructure, operated the equipment, maintained the security, and created the community that made it all possible. Oak Ridge represents American industrial power at its peak. The ability to mobilize resources, to solve unprecedented problems, to build the impossible. In 3 years, the United States transformed theoretical physics into industrial reality. That achievement remains staggering. But Oak Ridge also represents the moral complexity of that power. The bomb ended the war. It also killed more than 100,000 people in seconds and ushered in an age where human extinction became technically possible. The people who worked there carry that complexity. They are heroes and accomplices, saviors and killers, depending on how you view what happened. Most of them would reject such binary judgments. They did their jobs in wartime. They contributed to ending the war. They're proud of that, even as they acknowledge the terrible cost. For the families displaced to build Oak Ridge, the complexity is different but equally real. Their sacrifice was involuntary but consequential. They lost their homes so history could be made. There's no simple way to calculate whether that was justified, whether fair compensation was ever possible, whether the greater good outweighed the personal cost. What Oak Ridge ultimately teaches us is that history is made by collective action, by thousands of individual choices and contributions that add up to something larger than any single person could accomplish or fully understand. The young woman watching a dial didn't build the atomic bomb. But without her and thousands like her, the bomb doesn't exist. This creates a diffusion of responsibility that's both comforting and troubling. No single person at Oak Ridge bears full responsibility for Hiroshima. But all of them bear some responsibility. They were parts of a machine that produced a weapon of mass destruction. Yet they were also people living their lives under extraordinary circumstances. They were making the best choices they could with the information they had. They were contributing to what they believed was a just cause. They were, in short, human. The story of Oak Ridge matters not just as history but as a continuing reality. We still build weapons in secret. We still displace communities for projects deemed essential. We still ask people to work on things they can't discuss, to contribute to outcomes they may not understand until it's too late to change course. The questions raised by Oak Ridge remain unanswered. When is secrecy justified? When does the greater good outweigh individual rights? How do we balance the need for security with the need for transparency? How do we assign responsibility when actions are collective and understanding is compartmentalized? These aren't just historical questions. They're challenges we face now, in an age where technology continues to advance faster than our ethical frameworks can keep up. The people of Oak Ridge didn't have the luxury of philosophical reflection during the war. They had work to do, a war to win, families to support. They did what was asked of them. Only later could they fully grapple with what they had been part of. We have that luxury now. We can look back with full knowledge and ask the hard questions. Not to judge, but to learn. Not to condemn, but to understand. Because the story of Oak Ridge is ultimately about us, about what we're capable of when we work together toward a common goal, about the price we're willing to pay for victory, about the moral complexity of living in a world where the right choice isn't always clear. In the valleys of East Tennessee, where families once farmed land their ancestors had worked for generations, industrial facilities still hum with activity. The land remembers, even if most people have forgotten. The cemeteries were moved. The churches were demolished. The roads lead nowhere. But the story remains. The town that vanished to build America's atomic bomb. The secret city that changed the world. The place where 75,000 people lived in a city that officially didn't exist, working on a project they couldn't discuss, contributing to history they wouldn't understand until it was too late to change it. Oak Ridge, Tennessee, where the future was built by people who couldn't know what they were building, where the war ended in the most terrible way imaginable, where ordinary people did extraordinary things and carried the weight of it for the rest of their lives. Their story deserves to be remembered, not just the achievement, but the cost, not just the victory, but the sacrifice, not just the triumph, but the tragedy, because all of it is true, all of it happened, and all of it matters. The dial watchers and the displaced families, the scientists and the construction workers, the pride and the guilt, the necessity and the horror. This is the story of Oak Ridge. This is the story of the town that vanished to build America's atomic bomb. And it's a story that's still not finished. Because we still live in the world Oak Ridge created. We still face the questions it raised. We still carry the burden of the power it unleashed. May we have the wisdom to use that power better than the world has used it so far. May we remember the cost it exacted, and may we never forget the people who paid that cost, willingly or not, in the valleys of East Tennessee in the years when the world changed forever.